Hello again, everybody. I can't believe we're right at the end of the book now, just one more chapter. And if you remember yesterday, Ben had managed to persuade Mrs. Craven that if he and the other children in his class cleared everything up, got all the water out of the school, then she would keep Mrs. Peacock. So let's see what happens. It might all go horribly wrong. This is chapter 12, All Change Back. Ben didn't really know where to start. He'd only thought about saving Mrs. Peacock. He hadn't thought about what he would do once he had saved her. He looked around the room helplessly. The others were just messing about, whooping and shouting and giving each other high fives. He needed to get things in order, and quickly. Otherwise, as sure as eggs is eggs, as his grandma would say, Mrs. Peacock would go and Mrs. Craven would be in, teaching his class. No more magic conkers, no more carrots with legs, no more puppets that came to life, no more eating fruit in the playground, just 9 to 3 boredom. Ben wondered what his mum would do in this situation. He thought about all the times the house had been a mess caused by him and Ella, and how his mum got busy, and before you knew it, everything was back to how it should be, usually just before his dad walked through the door. He pictured his mum busy with the hoover, throwing toys back in the box, ticking things off a list. A list, that was it. He needed to make a list. His mum always said if you had a list you could do anything and tick it off as you did it. That way you could see what you still needed to do. She'd tried to make Ben do lists for his homework projects, but he could never be bothered. He never got beyond write name and date at top of paper. It was a waste of time. But now, suddenly, he could see the point of it. They would make a list and tick things off as they did them. Ben turned to face the whiteboard. The water level had dropped and there was enough room to make a list on the board. A red pen hung from a lump of blue tack above the board. Ben hoped it would still work after being submerged in water. He grabbed the pen and turned back to his classmates. "Right," he shouted, sounding just like Mrs. Peacock. The others stopped messing and looked at Ben expectantly. "We've got a lot to do if we want to keep Mrs. Peacock," he said, glancing up at the top of the cupboard. The flowers on the hat shook. "First, we need to make a list." "That's a good idea," said Joe Rimmer, much to Ben's surprise. He smiled back at Joe. "OK, you lot, shout out and I'll write it on the whiteboard." Within a few minutes, Ben had written his list. He wasn't too sure of all the spellings, but he didn't think Mrs. Peacock would mind, just for once. It was all in a good cause. There were 10 items on the list, 10 things to do before home time. He read it through quickly to himself. Get water out of classroom. Get last drop of water out of school. Get Mrs. Craven off ladders. Get Mrs. Craven into her office. Dry Mrs. Craven's clothes. Ben wasn't too sure how they were going to do this, and he didn't really like to think about it too much. He hoped she would have some ideas herself. Dry books that are wet. Everybody get changed. Hang swimming things on pegs. Put desks back in right places. And make sure everything is ready for Monday. Ben let out his breath in a long sigh. "Is that everything?" he asked the others. "What about Mrs. Peacock?" said Megan worriedly. "We can't leave her up there." She nodded her head towards the top of the cupboard. The flowers wobbled and shook. Ben couldn't believe he'd forgotten about Mrs. Peacock in all this. He turned back to the board. 11, he wrote quickly. Get Mrs. Peacock off the cupboard. Ben decided that he and Jake should rescue Mrs. Craven. Maybe he wouldn't feel so bad then for locking her in her office earlier that day. It seemed a long time ago now. A lot had happened since then. Ben opened the door and once again was swept along on a tide of water. Jake was right behind him, arms and legs waving in the air. Ben could see Mrs. Craven bobbing up and down on the ladders as the swell of water hit them. She watched anxiously as Ben and Jake were tossed towards her. "Grab the ladders," shouted Ben to Jake, reaching out his right arm towards them. Jake lunged towards the ladders and grabbed at a step. Mrs. Craven wobbled back and forth for a few seconds before steadying herself. She smiled for the first time that morning. "Oh, thank you, boys," she said. "Thank you so much. You must each have a sticker for your charts for this kind act." Ben didn't have the heart to tell her the sticker charts were floating soggily about the classroom, and most of the stickers had come unstuck anyway. "Do you know," continued Mrs. Craven, as Ben and Jake untied the string and began to guide the ladders towards Mrs. Craven's office, "somebody," she paused to convey her shock, "somebody locked me in my office this morning." Ben and Jake concentrated on the ladders. Ben didn't dare look at Jake. "Anyway, you two have restored my faith in human nature." Mrs. Craven nodded and smiled at the two boys. Ben hadn't got a clue what she was talking about, but he guessed it was good as she looked happy and she wasn't telling them off. Thank goodness she didn't know it had been Ben who had turned that key. The boys steered the ladders into Mrs. Craven's office, past Mrs. Brooks, who was sitting on her desk with her head in her hands. The newsletters floated about the room. "Thank you again, boys," said Mrs. Craven. "As soon as the water's gone, I shall get off these ladders and change into my PE kit." Ben stifled a giggle. He couldn't imagine Mrs. Craven in a PE kit. It would be even worse than Mrs. Peacock in that swirly pink and purple swimming costume. Jake followed Ben out of Mrs. Craven's office and back past Mrs. Brooks. The water level had dropped dramatically and was nearly down to the floor. Newsletters were stuck along the walls. There was one stuck to Mrs. Brooks' back. Ben guessed she didn't know or she would have removed it. She always liked to look so perfect. A newsletter on your back wasn't exactly the height of fashion. Even Ben knew that. The boys didn't have to swim back up the corridor. The water was gushing out of the front door and cascading down the path, sending little rivulets across the playground. Ben thought it was like wading through a deep puddle on the way back, the sort that his mum made him put his wellies on for. She'd get a shock if she could see him now, he thought, grinning to himself and kicking the water before him. Numbers 1, 6, 7, 8 and 9 had been ticked off the list by the time Ben and Jake returned to the classroom. "Well done, everybody," said Ben proudly, looking round the room at the books steaming on the radiators and the desks back in their neat groups. The floor was still wet, but there wasn't even enough for a puddle in here. Everybody had changed back into school uniform, although they were rather damp still, and swimming things had been hung on pegs. Ben reached for the pen and ticked off numbers 4 and 5, even though Mrs. Craven's dry clothes weren't quite a definite yet. He was sure they soon would be. This was going well. "Jake and I need to get changed now," said Ben. "Then all we need to do is make sure there isn't a drop of water left in school and everything's ready for Monday." He grinned round at everyone. "And then we'll get Mrs. Peacock down." They decided it might be best if they passed Mrs. Peacock's towel and clothes up to her on top of the cupboard where she could get dressed without getting wet again. They would dry the floor, check the corridor, make sure Mrs. Craven was happy, and then they would get Mrs. Peacock down. For now, thought Ben, she's safer up there. By the time the bell rang at 3 o'clock, Ben felt as though he'd done a week's work. Class 4P spilled out of school and headed for home. On Fridays, Ben's mum always picked him up. They went shopping, which he hated, although it wasn't so bad if Jake and his mum came too. It looked as though that was the plan tonight. The two mums were deep in conversation, nodding and laughing. Ben's mum absently rocked the pram as she talked. Ben and Jake zigzagged across the playground towards them. "How was your swimming?" asked Ben's mum, taking his bag and putting it under the buggy. "Fine," said Ben, looking at Jake. Jake grinned. "Still don't know what that nutty woman's playing at," said Ben's mum, half to Ben and half to Jake's mum. "She needs to make her mind up, that one." Jake's mum laughed and shook her head. "Oh, she has," said Ben, grinning back at Jake. "She definitely has. No more swimming on a Friday. She says she thinks we'll stick to once a week in future."